Morning, folks. I'm outside because I love being outside. Get outside as much as you possibly can right now. Do not, just because we're sheltering in place or there's a stay-at-home order does not mean that you cannot be outside. I think it's really important. Vitamin D, Lux Energy, even if you get out for 30 minutes a day, maybe an hour, just get out, fresh air, birds. I'm sharing them with you right now because I think hopefully you can hear them. There's a squirrel climbing up the tree. Anyway, let's stay focused, Rawson. So here's the deal, right? We've now arrived. We're in Jesus Week, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and post my PowerPoints for you to make it a little bit easier. Sometimes you'll see that I'll use sort of the video component while I'm showing you the PowerPoints, but sometimes I'm just going to talk through them and you can access them yourself. I'll have them located on the modules. So what I want to do, since I already gave you an encouraging message for this week, what I want to do right now is I want to just talk through what's going to happen over the next 4 weeks, because that's all we have left. So the first week, we're going to talk about the birth narratives, right? We're going to look at them in interfaith perspective. We'll talk about the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek. Anyway, we'll discuss that at the end of the week. And then we'll talk about the Noble Eightfold Path in Buddhism, right? Again, what we're going to try to do is think about Jesus's life and ministry and Christianity in conversation with, right, as always, global perspectives, but also other world religions. So week 2, we're going to talk about the parables and the teachings. Week 3, we're going to talk about this idea of the way, not just in Christianity, but in other, right? We see the idea of the way in Buddhism. We see it in Hinduism, right? Other world religions have the same concept of following the way. We'll also talk about crucifixion and resurrection and think about that in literal and also figurative ways. And then finally, we're going to discuss that very last week. We'll talk about Revelation, we'll talk about hell, end times, we'll talk about other things as well. We're going to talk about identity and social stratification a little bit more. We'll talk about gender, sexuality. We'll get a little bit deeper into those things. Hopefully also we'll be dealing a little bit more with some of those questions that we started to ask at the beginning of the semester. Always feel free to email me. I'm not actually going to be holding traditional office hours, so if you have any questions, just email me, and if there are questions that you want to discuss in class, or if you want me to discuss them on the video and then we can have discussion threads, that's also fine. Just let me know, email me. So briefly, the New Testament. Now we've moved from the Hebrew Bible, right? There are about 300, 400 years that are not accounted for in the traditional Christian canon. There are books in between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament called the Apocryphal books that some of them are apocalyptic, prophetic. Anyway, we're not going to be looking at those. We're going from the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament into the New Testament, and what we begin with is the 4 Gospels, right? And these Gospels, right, the word gospel in Greek is euangelon, and it means good news, right? So this is good news for these people who at this point were considering themselves to be Jewish, right? The people of Israel, they were also the Hebrews. So these Gospels represent the good news. And so this is good news then about the life and ministry of Jesus. Remember when I talked about Moses, Moshe, and Joshua, both of their names meant Messiah. Jesus, Yeshua, also means Messiah. So his name then is symbolic of who he would become. So in the New Testament, we've got 4 Gospels, we've got the Acts of the Apostles, we've got these letters that are written by Paul, and then we have the Apocalypse or Revelation, which is a vision, again, some would say is a vision of the end times and also a vision of heaven and hell. We'll get into that in the last week that we have together. What I want to talk about briefly, because today you had to read from the 4 Gospels, and what you read were the beginning, that first 1 or 2 chapters of each of the Gospels. And what I wanted you to do as you were reading them is to think about the differences in each, right? So each of them represents the beginning of Jesus' ministry or his birth in a different way, right? What you probably noticed is that Matthew and Luke actually have birth narratives. Mark does not. Mark is in fact the oldest gospel that was written. And so the reason that he doesn't have a birth narrative, most scholars believe, is because the tradition around Jesus' birth developed much later. John also, right, that last gospel, John, does not have a more historiographical birth narrative. What it provides is a more figurative, right, a more cosmic sort of representation of who Jesus is, and you know, Jesus as the Word, right? So that's symbolic. Jesus symbolically as the Word, and this word in Greek is logos, and what it means, right? There's a large semantic range. So the word logos, in the beginning was the Word, in the beginning was the logos, is word, reason, right? Some of us know this word, as we talked about, because of like biology, for instance. It's the study of something. But there's a way in which John was appealing to this idea of Jesus as something bigger than just a human being. And it is figurative, it is metaphorical. But let me just say this, because you'll notice on the PowerPoint that I move into this slide that talks about the four Gospels and when they were written, right? So I said to you that Mark is actually understood to have been written earliest. It's also the shortest Gospel. It has the least amount of details. Typically that's how scholars know an earlier text, right? It's more rudimentary, right? More simple. And you'll notice that as we read Mark a little bit more. Why are we reading all four Gospels? Why does it matter that we're reading Jesus' story? Because what I want us to do is start to look at the way in which different traditions developed around the idea of Jesus and who Jesus was and how to convey the story of Jesus, right? So you've got the actual, to the degree that we can sort of approximate, right? Scholars believe that Jesus lived between around 0 or 3 CE to 33 or 36 CE. So he lived till about 33 years, right? Paul, the Apostle Paul, wrote around between 50 and 64 CE, right? So just bracket that. Some of you are going to be like, Paul, whatever. He wrote a lot of letters to churches that were growing and that were following in the way of Jesus, right? But what's interesting is the Gospels were actually written after the writings of Paul. And Paul was probably the most influential writer, I mean, hands down, in terms of thinking about the way that the Christian tradition would develop. But the Gospels themselves were written between 70 and 110 CE. So we've got Mark written in 70, we've got Matthew and Luke written in the 90s, and then we've got John written around 100 or so. What does that mean? Well, if you think about it, if Jesus died around between 33 and 36 CE, you don't have Gospels. First of all, Paul wasn't writing, and Paul didn't even know Jesus personally. So Paul didn't write until 50 CE, right? And then we've got the Gospels not being written until 70 CE. So that means there's almost a 40-year gap before the first Gospels are written. Now, I want you to think about that. If there's a 40-year gap before the first Gospels are written, what exactly then could happen within those years? Right? If there are 40 years, a 40-year gap between when Jesus lived and died and when the Gospels, the accounts about his life, were actually written, right? I mean, think about it. It's like a game of telephone, right? You guys play that when you were younger. I loved it. I was usually that ninny muggins who would actually tweak the message intentionally just to make it funnier and to annoy people, because that's what I do. But so if you think about it, right, there's a way in which these stories about Jesus, they're being orally transmitted, as we talked about, right? Ancient tradition, right? Ancient cultures transmitted things orally, right? Most people couldn't read and write, although we're getting, right, more literate folks as we move into the first century. But what I want us to think about is the fact that you've got people adding things, taking things away, right? Certain people believe certain things about Jesus, others don't. 40 years can change the message significantly. And when we look at these four Gospels, we see that each of them has some similar some commonalities, but they all have their differences as well. And what we're going to do throughout the semester is think about those differences. What I want to do just briefly, this is the last thing that I want to do in this lecture portion, is I want you guys to turn to that next slide, composing the canon. So when and how did the New Testament become the Bible? It's important to know that it didn't actually become the canon until about 367 CE, around them. And for some, right, they would say that the canon wasn't actually fully instituted until the 6th century CE, right? So again, we're talking like 300 plus years, possibly even 500 years after Jesus lived and walked, right? And who did that was the church fathers, right? So when I say church fathers, we're thinking now about the Catholic Church, right? But they're the ones that determined the canon. They determined which books got in and which books were left out, okay? So the criterion was widespread readership, apostolic connection, relevance to the universal church, doctrinal orthodoxy. They had to be orthodox. They had to all sort of like fall in line with these traditional teachings that seemed to be right, orthodoxy, right teachings. And then they had to be divinely inspired. Well, there are a lot of gospels that actually were not included. And in fact, those gospels, a number of them were actually earlier than the gospels that were included in the canon. I want to give you guys an example of some of the stories that were left out of the gospel. So flip with me to the next slide, and I want you to look with me at the Gospel of Thomas. Now, within the Gospel of Thomas, again, also written earlier than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we've got some stories about Jesus' childhood. What you'll notice in the Gospels that are in the biblical canon, so included in the Bible, is that we do not see a lot about Jesus' childhood. In fact, we see nothing except for in Luke when he's in the temple teaching, right? Thomas has the stories about Jesus' childhood. And I want you to go ahead and read these, right? I'm not going to, just because for the sake of time, this video is already about 12 minutes long. I'm not going to read all of these, but I do want you guys to read them and to think about why they were left out, right? Why would these stories not be included in the canon? Why would the church fathers not want these kind of stories to be told and widely disseminated about Jesus, right? In this first section, right, that I have, we see Jesus creates sparrows out of clay, right? Who does that? Who also creates life out of clay? Do, 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 do. Ding, 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 ding. God, absolutely. At creation, God created human beings out of the dump, out of the earth, out of the mud. So then we move on, and we see not only was he creating life, but he was doing it on the Sabbath. So he broke a law, right? One of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not work on the Sabbath. Jesus did it, right? So we see a Jesus who is breaking the rules and also creating things, right? So interesting here. Why might the church fathers have left that one out? Think about it. All right. So the next one we see, Jesus got angry, and he actually tells a kid, he gets angry at this little kid, and he says, behold, now also you will be withered like a tree and will not bear leaves, neither root nor fruit. And the lad immediately withered up. In other words, Jesus withered a little boy up. That's what he did because he was angry, right? Why might that have been left out? Think about it. Another story about Jesus as a child, and again, you guys, these were very popular stories that were told a lot about Jesus, right? They wouldn't have become a gospel if they hadn't have been, but again, were left out of the canon. So next, after that, again, he went through the village, and a child ran and bumped against his shoulder, and Jesus was provoked, and he said to him, you will not finish your way. Literally, you're not going to go all the way. And immediately the child fell down and died. In other words, what did Jesus do? Spoke and killed this little boy. Why might the church fathers have not wanted this one in the gospel or in the canon? And then finally we see this other story about Jesus. he blinds all these people because they speak ill of him, right? And he basically tells his dad, don't mess with me. You know what I mean? Like, I can do whatever I want, and the only reason that I'm listening to you is because basically you're my dad. So all these interesting things, but I want us to think about the way in which, right, the church fathers decided what was put in and what was left out. And I want us to think about why, right? What would have been happening for them? What would have been behind their desire to keep certain things in and leave others out, right? So the last thing that I want to say is this. It's clear from the Gospels that the earlier Gospels presented Jesus in a more human light, and the later Gospels and later teachings began to present Jesus in a more divine light. I've put the Nicene Creed here for you because this was written in 325 CE. Earlier, we see people seeing Jesus as human, as a teacher who clearly is divinely inspired. As time goes on, we begin to see people interpreting and experiencing Jesus as, right, as the Nicene Creed points out, as equal to God. And that's something that I want us to think about, right? We've talked about these trajectories, about the way that God is seen, right? We've even talked about the trajectory of a little bit of the idea of Satan, right? Over time, these things begin to develop. Why is that, right? What's going on there? What might be the purpose or the motive or the understanding of Jesus that shifts sort of the frame from thinking about him as more human and less divine to thinking about him as more divine and less human, right? Might there be motives behind that? You know, might it simply just be that people began to experience Jesus and the power of God through Jesus in new ways, right? These are all things that I want us to really think about as we dive more deeply into the Gospels. All right, check you later.